Agnes Holloway was 64 years old when she walked into the abandoned logging cookhouse with her dead husband's hard hat under one arm and rainwater dripping from her coat. The building stood deep in Oregon timber country, where fir trees rose like black walls and old logging roads vanished under moss. Everyone in Briar Glen said the cookhouse was worthless. The roof sagged. The windows were broken. The long tables were gray, with rot. In the center of the room sat a cracked iron stove. Agnes had bought the place for $11 after Harker Timber denied her husband's death benefit and called Daniel Holloway careless. They said no sane widow would sleep there. But what nobody knew was that the stove had not been empty all those years. On her first night, Agnes built a small fire with wet hands. As the iron warmed, something behind the stove gave a low metallic pop. She reached into the black hollow and pulled out a smoke-stained ledger wrapped in oilcloth. When she opened it, she saw Daniel's name, and beneath it was the beginning of a truth the forest had kept hidden. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from. If stories like this matter to you, like and subscribe, because this one begins with a woman everyone had counted out. Long before Agnes Holloway became a widow, she was a little girl waiting beside a muddy logging road for men to come home from the trees. She grew up in a narrow company house outside Briar Glen, Oregon, where everything smelled of wet bark, sawdust, smoke, and wool coats that never fully dried. Her father, Eli Mercer, worked timber before sunrise and returned after dark with pitch on his sleeves and cuts across his hands. Agnes remembered his lunch pail more clearly than his voice. It was dented silver, with a red cloth tied around the handle. Every morning, her mother packed it with biscuits and black coffee. Every evening, Agnes listened for that pail hitting the porch step. In logging towns, children learned early that the forest gave wages with one hand and took men with the other. When Agnes was 9, her father did not come home. 2 men from the company brought back his lunch pail instead. One kept his hat in his hands. The other said there had been an equipment failure up on Ridgeline 4. He said the company was sorry. He said papers would come. The papers arrived 3 days later in a clean white envelope. Agnes's mother sat at the kitchen table, moving her lips over words she could barely understand. There were forms, numbers, signatures, and one sentence typed so neatly it seemed cruel. No company fault established. Her mother folded the papers and placed them in the bottom drawer beside flour sacks and unpaid bills. She did not cry where Agnes could see. She simply went quiet, and the whole house felt smaller. That was the first thing Agnes learned about loss. It did not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrived typed, stamped, signed, and folded. After that, Agnes began saving paper. At first, it was childish. She kept school notices, grocery slips, and old envelopes in a biscuit tin under her bed. But as she grew older, the habit became sharper. She learned to read dates. She learned to compare signatures. She learned that the same man could write his name 2 different ways when he was lying in a hurry. Her mother used to say, "A poor woman keeps what rich men throw away." Agnes never forgot it. By the time she married Daniel Holloway, she was already the kind of woman who wrote everything down. Daniel was a timber faller with patient hands and a quiet laugh. He checked his boots before dawn. He checked his saw twice. Every morning, before Daniel left for work, Agnes wrote the date in a small brown notebook. Beneath it, she wrote the time he stepped out, the camp, the weather, and the foreman's name if she knew it. Daniel teased her gently. "You could make a grocery list look like court evidence," he once said. Agnes tapped her pencil against the page. "Then maybe someday, a court will finally read one." He smiled, but he never asked her to stop. The notebook became part of their marriage. It sat near the bread box, pencil tied to its spine with butcher's string. Beside the door hung Daniel's yellow hard hat, scratched across the crown, with a small cross Agnes had drawn inside the rim. She had drawn it there after one of Daniel's friends lost 2 fingers to a jammed saw, and the company called it operator error. Agnes did not trust words like that. Operator error. Worker negligence. Failure to follow procedure. They were clean words for bloody things. Years passed. Harker Timber grew larger. The Harker name appeared on church repairs, campaign signs, and the mayor's picnic banners. In Briar Glen, Nobody spoke against the Harkers, unless they were ready to lose something. Then came the morning that looked ordinary. Daniel stood in the kitchen before dawn. Rain tapped the window. Agnes opened her notebook. "Camp 3 today," he said. "Who's running the crew?" Daniel hesitated just long enough for her pencil to stop. "Blevins." Agnes looked up. "I thought Blevins was moved to Ridgeline." "So did I." He tried to smile, but something tired sat in his face. He picked up his lunch pail, took his hard hat from the peg, and paused at the door as if listening to the rain. Agnes would remember that pause more than anything. By sunset, the stew had gone cold. By 8, she had opened the front door 3 times. At 9:17, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. 2 Harker timber trucks stopped outside. No ambulance. No Daniel. A company man stepped onto the porch with Sheriff Coyle behind him. He said there had been an accident. He said Daniel had entered an unsafe cut zone. He said Daniel had failed to follow procedure. Agnes looked past him to the truck bed, where Daniel's yellow hard hat sat upside down in the rain. Later, alone in the kitchen, she opened the envelope they left behind. Daniel Holloway, worker negligence. And beneath that, his name was misspelled. But the thing that finally broke Agnes Holloway's life open did not arrive as thunder in the forest. It arrived folded inside an envelope, with her husband's name typed wrong, and the word negligence placed beside it, like a stone on his grave. For 2 days after Daniel's death, Agnes Holloway did not leave the kitchen except to sleep in the chair beside the cold stove. People came through the front door with covered dishes, folded napkins, and voices softened by pity. They brought soup, biscuits, jars of preserves, and sentences that sounded kind until Agnes asked a question. Did anyone see Daniel at Camp 3 that morning? Then the room changed. Men looked toward their wives. Wives looked down at their plates. Someone said the rain had been hard. Someone else said the company would know best. Near the back door stood Tom Reyes, an old sawyer with 3 missing fingers on his left hand. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. Agnes noticed. She had spent her whole life watching what people almost said. After the funeral, Briar Glen returned to work with frightening speed. Chainsaws started before sunrise. Log trucks rolled through town with mud on their tires. At church, Daniel's name was read aloud, but no one mentioned negligence. No one mentioned the envelope. No one mentioned the way Sheriff Coyle had stood behind the company man, silent as a post. Agnes kept Daniel's yellow hard hat on the kitchen table. She washed the mud from its rim and dried the inside with one of his handkerchiefs. Then, she set it beside her brown notebook and opened the company report again. The first page was clean and official. Daniel Holloway, employee number 4187, had entered an unsafe cut zone at approximately 4:40 p.m. He had failed to observe marked boundaries. He had neglected standard procedure. His death, the report said, was an unavoidable result of individual error. Agnes read that line 3 times. Daniel did not ignore marked boundaries. He marked them for younger men. He did not step onto loose ground after heavy rain unless a foreman ordered it and signed off. He was careful in the way poor men become careful when a single mistake can leave a wife with nothing. She turned to her own notebook. That morning, she had written, Camp 3, rain steady, Blevins foreman. Daniel left 5:12 a.m. The report listed another name, foreman, Earl Whitcomb. Agnes laid her notebook beside the company paper. The kitchen seemed to grow colder. On the 3rd day after the funeral, she drove to the Harker Timber office. The building sat on the best corner of Main Street, built from polished cedar and river stone. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, varnish, and new carpet. Framed photographs of Harker men lined the hallway, each one standing beside a felled tree wider than a kitchen table. A young receptionist asked whether Agnes had an appointment. Agnes said, "My husband is dead. I think that ought to count." They made her wait 42 minutes. She wrote that down. At last, Mr. Vale came out. He was the same man who had brought the envelope to her porch. In daylight, he looked smaller, pink-faced, freshly shaved, with a tie too bright for a town still wearing funeral black. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, We understand this is difficult. No, Agnes said. You understand, it is inconvenient. His smile tightened. He led her into a conference room where another man already sat with a folder open in front of him. The man wore a gray suit and did not offer his hand. Agnes knew a company lawyer when she saw one. Mr. Vale explained that the review had been completed. The findings were clear. Because Daniel had violated safety protocol, Harker Timber could not authorize full death compensation. Agnes placed her notebook on the table. You wrote the wrong foreman's name. The lawyer looked at the notebook as if it were something dirty. Mrs. Holloway, small discrepancies can feel meaningful during grief. They are meaningful when a man is dead. Mr. Vale shifted in his chair. Crew assignments can change. Then show me the change order. For the first time, both men stopped moving. The lawyer closed the folder halfway. Those records are company property. My husband was not company property. Neither man answered. Agnes left with no check, no apology, and no records. But she had seen the lawyer's eyes move when she mentioned the foreman. Just once, to the left side of the folder, where loose pages were clipped beneath a brass fastener. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything down. Time arrived, names spoken, folder color, brass clip, left side, 42 minutes waiting, refused change order. Then she opened the bottom drawer where she kept her father's old accident papers. Agnes had carried them through marriage, lean winters, and spring cleanings. She had never known why, except that throwing them away felt like burying Eli Mercer twice. The paper had yellowed. The ink had faded, but the sentence remained. No company fault established. Agnes looked at the signature near the bottom. Whitcomb, the same surname that had appeared in Daniel's report where Blevens's should have been. For the first time since Daniel died, grief moved aside just enough for anger to stand up. Not loud anger, not wild anger. Agnes had never trusted anger that burned itself out too quickly. This was colder. This was the kind that sharpened a pencil. She wrote Whitcomb on a clean page. Under it, she wrote Daniel, then Eli, then a question mark. Outside, log trucks rolled through the rain, their headlights sliding across her curtains like searchlights. For 64 years, Agnes had been told that logging took men because logging was dangerous. That night, beside Daniel's hard hat, she began to wonder if danger was only the story they gave women after the truth had already been carried away. The letter from Harker Timber arrived 5 days after Agnes found the Whitcomb name in her father's old papers. It came in a long white envelope with the company seal printed in green at the top. Agnes opened it with the bread knife because her hands were too stiff for the flap. The letter did not say Daniel had been careless in plain human language. It said compensation was denied due to failure to comply with established safety procedures. It said the company regretted her loss. It said any further questions should be directed through proper legal channels. There was no check. Agnes read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the other papers. She did not tear it. Bad paper, her mother had taught her, was still paper, and paper could become evidence if a woman lived long enough to put it in the right order. But order did not pay the mortgage. By the end of the month, the bank called twice. By the next week, they called every morning. The house on Alder Road had never been grand, but it had held 38 years of marriage. Daniel had painted the porch rails blue because Agnes once said the color reminded her of clear weather. He had planted 2 apple trees by the back fence and built her a shelf above the kitchen window for jars of dried herbs. Now, a young loan officer named Preston Gale sat across from her at the bank and spoke about options. He was polite in the careful way people become polite when they are taking something. You may want to consider selling before formal action begins, he said. It would give you more control. Agnes looked at his soft hands resting on the desk. Control over which part? Losing it now or losing it later? His face reddened. Mrs. Holloway, I'm only trying to help. No, she said quietly. You're trying to make the paperwork clean. Outside the bank, rain blew sideways down Main Street. Across the road, a Harker Timber truck rolled past, its green logo bright against the gray. The driver did not look at her, but he slowed just enough for Agnes to know he had seen. That was how Briar Glen began to close around her. The butcher stopped writing purchases on credit. A woman from church suggested, too gently, that grief could make people suspicious. The pastor offered prayer, but not testimony. Sheriff Coyle told Agnes that accusing Harker Timber without proof could be considered harassment. "I asked for records," Agnes said. "You asked after the matter was settled. My husband is dead." "It is not settled." The sheriff sighed. "Don't make enemies you can't afford." That sentence stayed with her. Enemies you can't afford. As if justice was a luxury item on a high shelf. Agnes tried 2 lawyers in the county seat. The first told her timber cases were expensive. The second asked whether Daniel had ever had problems with memory, drinking, anger, depression, anything the company might use. Agnes stood up before he finished the list. By November, the first foreclosure notice came. She found it pinned inside the screen door, wet at one corner from the rain. For a moment, she only stared at it. Then, she stepped into the kitchen and stood beneath the shelf Daniel had built for her herb jars. Everything in that room had been touched by him. The worn place where he stood to drink coffee. The patched chair where he sat to take off his boots. His coat still hanging on the peg because Agnes had not yet learned how to move it without feeling she was helping him disappear. That night, she packed the first box, not because she accepted it, because she had learned long ago that a woman could grieve and prepare at the same time. She packed papers first, Daniel's pay stubs, her notebooks, Eli Mercer's accident report, the Harker denial letter, the bank notices. She wrapped Daniel's hard hat in a towel and placed it on top. The auction listing appeared in the county paper 2 weeks later, printed between a farm equipment sale and a notice about surplus road gravel. Abandoned logging cookhouse. Former Harker camp, no. 3. Structure unsafe. No utilities. Access road limited. Minimum bid. $11. Agnes read it 3 times. Camp 3, the place Daniel had gone the morning he died. She drove to the county office the next day. The clerk, a tired woman with silver hair and red glasses, slid the property sheet across the counter. "You don't want that one," she said. "Nobody does." "Why?" "Roof's bad. Wells questionable. Stove cracked. Road washes out. Harker abandoned it years ago." "Harker still own it?" "Not anymore." "Tax default." "County took it." Agnes ran one finger over the map. The cookhouse sat alone beyond the old spur road, near the timber line where Camp 3 had once fed crews before dawn. The clerk lowered her voice. "Mrs. Holloway, if you're looking for somewhere to live, that place is barely standing." Agnes thought of the bank notice, thought of Daniel's name spelled wrong, thought of Sheriff Coyle telling her what enemies she could afford. "What day is the auction?" The county auction was held in a room that smelled of dust, coffee, and wet coats. Men came for tractors, scrap equipment, and seized tools. When the cookhouse lot came up, a few people laughed before the auctioneer finished reading. Former Harker Camp 3 Cookhouse. Minimum bid, $11. Any interest? No one raised a hand. The auctioneer started to move on. Agnes lifted her bidder card. The room turned. Somebody muttered, "That widow's lost her mind." Another man said, louder, "Let her have the rats." Agnes kept her hand steady. The auctioneer blinked. $11 from Mrs. Holloway. Any advance? Silence. Rain ticked against the windows. Sold. Agnes counted $11 from the envelope in her purse. It was almost all the cash she had left after gas and groceries. The clerk stamped the receipt and slid it toward her. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Mr. Vale from Harker Timber stood beneath a black umbrella. He looked at the receipt in her hand, then at her face. "That property is dangerous," he said. "So was my husband's job." His mouth tightened. "You should think carefully before going out there." Agnes folded the receipt and tucked it inside her notebook. "I have been thinking carefully all my life." Then she walked past him into the rain, carrying the deed to a building nobody wanted, on the road to the last place Daniel Holloway had eaten before the forest took his name. Agnes did not leave for the cookhouse the next morning. She wanted to. Pride told her to pack before sunrise and let Briar Glen watch her drive away without lowering her head. But pride did not patch tires, stretch flour, or keep a woman warm in a building with no power. So she took 3 days. She packed paper first, her notebooks, Daniel's pay stubs, the denial letter, the foreclosure notice, Eli Mercer's accident report, and the deed to the cookhouse. Then came coffee, beans, flour, canned peaches, salt, 2 blankets, a lantern, matches sealed in a jar, a hammer, rope, nails, and Daniel's whetstone. Last, she took his yellow hard hat from the kitchen table. For a moment, she held it with both hands. The small cross inside the rim had faded but not disappeared. "You're coming," she whispered. On the 4th morning, rain covered Briar Glen in a gray sheet. Agnes loaded the pickup before daylight. Water ran down her neck as she tied a tarp over the boxes. Across the street, Mrs. Larkin's curtain moved once, then fell still. No one came out. No one asked where she would sleep. She went back inside one last time. The shelf Daniel had built above the kitchen window was empty. His coat still hung on the peg by the door. Agnes touched the sleeve, pressed the wool between her fingers, and took it down. She locked the door and placed the key under the loose brick by the step. It was not her house anymore, not in the way Banks measured things. But leaving the key there felt like the last small act of belonging. The road out of town ran past the mill yard. Stacks of cut timber stood behind the fence, black with rain. The Harker timber sign shone green against the morning. Agnes slowed but did not stop. Men in orange vests moved between trucks. One looked up. Another nudged him. By noon, pavement had become gravel. By 1 o'clock, gravel had become mud. The old road to Camp 3 had not been cared for in years. Ferns leaned into the ruts. Alder branches scraped the truck doors. Moss hung from the maples. And the firs stood so thick above her that the sky narrowed to a pale strip. Twice, Agnes stopped to drag fallen limbs aside. Once, the back tires slid toward a ditch filled with black water. She sat still, hands locked around the wheel, and listened to rain ticking on the roof. Then she whispered, "Not yet," and eased forward until the tires caught. There were no houses now, no porch lights, no church bell, only rain, branches, and the distant sound of water moving below the road. The farther she drove, the more she understood why no one had bid against her. The cookhouse was not simply abandoned. It had been left behind on purpose. At a bend in the road, she saw the first sign, Harker Camp No. Dree. The board leaned sideways, half swallowed by blackberry vines. The paint had peeled until the words looked like bone showing through skin. Camp 3. Daniel had said those words on his last morning. She opened her notebook and wrote, 2:18 p.m., reached old Camp 3 sign, road poor but passable, sign still standing. Then she looked into the trees. Somewhere beyond them, Daniel had taken his last breath, while men with clean hands decided what sentence would be typed beside his name. Agnes drove on. The road dipped, turned, and opened into a clearing. At first, she did not recognize the building as a cookhouse. It looked like the carcass of something large and tired, crouched under the trees. The roof sagged in the middle. One corner of the porch had collapsed. Several windows were broken. A rusted stovepipe leaned from the roof like a bent finger. Rainwater dripped from every board. Agnes turned off the engine. The silence after the truck stopped felt enormous. A crow called from above the roof, sharp as a warning. She stepped into mud up to the edge of her shoes. The air smelled of wet cedar, old ash, mildew, and rotting leaves. Blackberry canes caught at her coat as she crossed the clearing. The front door hung crooked, held by one hinge and a strip of rusted chain. A faded county notice had been nailed to the wood. Unsafe structure. Do not enter. Agnes touched the paper. Rain had softened it until the ink ran in blue veins. I've been called unsafe too, she said. The chain gave after 3 strikes from the hammer. Inside, the cookhouse was colder than outside. Long wooden tables stretched through the room, scarred by knives, cups, elbows, and years of men eating before daylight. Benches lay overturned. A calendar from 1989 curled on the wall. In one corner, a washtub sat beneath a leak, catching drops with a hollow ping. And in the center of the room stood the stove. Black iron, wide belly, cracked side, 4 round burners. Its small door hung open, as if it had been waiting with its mouth half shut. Agnes did not go to it at once. She walked slowly, placing each foot where the floor seemed strongest. Above the stove, smoke had stained the ceiling in dark circles. This place had fed men. Maybe it had fed Daniel. Maybe, on his last morning, he had sat at one of these tables with rain on his shoulders and coffee warming his hands. The thought struck hard enough that Agnes gripped the edge of a bench. Outside, the rain thickened. Behind her, the pickup sat in the clearing, loaded with boxes. For one terrible moment, Agnes wanted to turn around. She could still drive back before dark. She could ask the church for a cot. She could let the bank take the house. Let Harker keep its papers. Let Daniel's name stay where they had put it. Then she looked at the stove again. The crack in its side ran from top to bottom, but the iron still stood. Broken did not mean finished. Agnes went back to the truck, lifted Daniel's hard hat from the front seat, and carried it inside. She placed it at the head of the longest table. "There," she said softly. "We made it." The cookhouse gave no answer. Only rain, only dripping water. But Agnes Holloway stood in that ruined room with mud on her shoes. $11 gone from her purse, and nowhere left to return to. It was broken. It was cold. It was unwanted. And because of that, Agnes understood it perfectly. Agnes spent her first hour in the cookhouse, learning where not to step. The floor near the east wall dipped under her weight. A board by the pantry door split when she touched it with the toe of her boot. Near the back windows, rain had softened the wood until it looked dark and swollen, like old bread left too long in water. So she moved slowly. She carried one box at a time from the truck, setting each on the longest table instead of the floor. Papers first, food second, tools third, blankets last. Daniel's coat she folded over the bench beside his hard hat. The room smelled of wet wood, mouse droppings, ash, and something sour that had lived in the walls for years. Wind slipped through the broken windows and moved across Agnes's face like a cold hand. She had no electricity, no running water, no proper bed, no lock on the door except the chain she had broken to get inside. Still, she had walls. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. By late afternoon, she chose the driest corner of the room, where the roof still held and the floorboards answered solidly beneath her heel. She swept away broken glass, pine needles, and black pellets of mouse dirt. Then she laid down 2 old feed sacks, 1 blanket, and Daniel's coat rolled tight for a pillow. It did not look like a bedroom. It looked like surrender. Agnes stood over it for a moment, breathing through the ache in her chest. Then she said, "It will do for tonight." Work kept grief from swallowing her whole. She checked the pantry and found 3 rusted shelves, a flour bin chewed through at one corner, and a stack of chipped enamel plates. Behind the pantry door sat a wooden crate with a hammer, bent nails, a dull hatchet, and 2 coils of wire. Most of it was old. Some of it was still useful. Agnes carried the crate to the table and sorted everything into lines. Good nails, bad nails, wire, hinges, screws, kindling. Her mother had taught her that sorting was a kind of prayer. You took what the world had scattered and made it answerable again. Before dark, Agnes used wire and a bent hinge to pull one broken shutter across the largest window. It did not close fully, but it broke the wind. She dragged a bench against the front door and looped rope through the handle. It would not stop a determined man, but it would make noise. Noise was something. Next came water. A narrow door behind the cookhouse opened into a lean-to, nearly hidden under blackberry vines. Inside, Agnes found 2 dented rain barrels under a sagging gutter. The first barrel held only leaves and brown sludge. The second had several inches of clear rainwater beneath a lid of cedar boards. Agnes did not trust it. She dipped it with a tin cup, poured it through a clean cloth into her enamel pot, and set the pot near the stove. If she could boil it, she could use it. If the stove worked, she turned toward the black iron thing in the center of the room. It was larger than any stove she had ever owned, built to feed crews of hungry men before daylight. 4 round plates sat on top. The oven door hung crooked. A crack ran down the left side, dark and jagged. Ash filled the lower box. Agnes opened the stove door and coughed as old soot lifted into the air. "All right," she said. Let's see what you still know. She cleaned the firebox with a broken shovel and carried the ash outside in a bucket. Under the ash, she found coals hardened into black lumps, mouse bones, and a square-headed bolt that did not seem to belong. She placed the bolt on the table without thinking much of it. The stovepipe worried her more. If it was blocked, smoke would fill the room and drive her out before morning. She tied a rag around Daniel's old broom handle and pushed it up through the lower pipe. A rain of soot came down over her sleeves and hair. She coughed until her eyes watered. Then she laughed once, rough and surprised. No one saw her covered in soot. No one told her she was foolish. No one corrected her hands. The laugh faded quickly, but it left a little space behind. She found dry wood in the lean-to beneath a sheet of rusted tin. Not much, but enough. She split kindling with the dull hatchet, stacked it carefully, and struck one match. The first flame died. The second caught, shivered, and vanished. The third took. Agnes crouched on the cold floor and fed, its splinters no thicker than pencils. Slowly, the flame climbed. It touched the kindling, then the larger wood. Then the black belly of the stove began to tick as heat moved through old iron. Smoke pushed from the crack at first. Agnes held her breath, ready to kick the door open. Then the pipe drew. A thin stream of smoke rose, turned, and disappeared upward. The stove was wounded, but it was not dead. Agnes set the pot of filtered rainwater on top. When steam finally lifted from it, she put both hands over the warmth and closed her eyes. It was not comfort exactly. It was proof. Outside, evening settled into the trees. The rain softened. The cookhouse creaked as if remembering its own weight. Agnes ate beans from the enamel pot with a spoon and one heel of bread from home. She saved the canned peaches. Sweet things were for days when a woman needed convincing. Before sleeping, she walked the room with the lantern. She saw names cut into the tables, initials, dates, little marks made by men waiting for breakfast. Pay, weather, orders, D.H. was not there. Not that she could find, but she touched the scarred wood anyway. At the far end of the room, near the stove, a patch of floor had been replaced with newer boards. The color was wrong. The nail heads were newer too. Agnes noticed. She wrote it down, 9:06 p.m. Cookhouse livable in one corner. Stove draws despite crack. Rain barrel usable after boiling. Newer boards near stove. Then she placed the notebook beside Daniel's hard hat. The fire settled low. Heat moved through the room in uneven breaths. Shadows gathered in the broken windows. Somewhere outside, a branch scraped the wall with a sound like fingernails. Agnes lay down in her corner, wrapped in 2 blankets and Daniel's coat. The cookhouse was still ruined. The roof still leaked. The floor still sagged. The road behind her was mud, and the town ahead of her had already turned away. But above the smell of mildew and ash, Agnes could smell wood smoke. For the first time since Daniel's death, she had made something hold. Not much. A fire. A corner. A pot of water. A door that would rattle if opened. But it was enough to get her through one night. And one night, Agnes knew, was how every survival began. Morning came gray and cold. Agnes woke before full daylight, stiff from the floor and wrapped in Daniel's coat. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the smell returned. Ash, wet cedar, mildew, and rain. The cookhouse. She sat up and looked toward the long table. Daniel's hard hat was still there. That helped. The fire had died, but the stove still held one red coal beneath the ash. Agnes knelt, fed it splinters from the crate, and waited until a small flame returned. "Good," she whispered. "You and me both." She boiled rainwater, made thin coffee, and ate cold beans from the night before. Outside, fog hung between the firs. The clearing looked smaller in daylight, sealed off by trees and blackberry vines. After breakfast, Agnes inspected the stove. If she was going to survive here, that stove mattered more than anything. It could boil water, dry socks, warm the room, and keep dampness out of her bones. But smoke had leaked from the crack. And the iron had ticked strangely long after the fire settled. She cleared the ashes slowly, with the broken shovel, then a hand broom, then an old rag. She searched the firebox. She found blackened coal, 3 bent nails, a strip of wire, and 1 square-headed bolt. Agnes held the bolt near the lantern. It was not old in the same way the stove was old. Its edges were too sharp beneath the soot. She set it on the table and wrote in her notebook, 7:42 a.m. Square-headed bolt, found in firebox, threads still clean. Then she crouched behind the stove. The space was narrow, dusty, and cold. The back of the stove was rough cast iron, pitted by decades of heat. But one rectangular section near the lower back looked different. Smoother, straighter, too neat. Agnes leaned closer. 4 bolt holes marked its corners. One was empty. She looked toward the table. Her breath slowed. She ran her fingers along the edge. Soot blackened her skin. The panel did not move, but one corner gave a faint click when she pressed it. A false plate. Maybe it was only an old repair. Men in logging camps fixed things with whatever metal they had. There could be a plain explanation. But Agnes had learned that plain explanations were often where people hid complicated sins. She tried to loosen one remaining bolt with Daniel's screwdriver. It resisted. She pressed harder. The screwdriver slipped and cut the side of her thumb. Pain flashed. She wrapped the thumb in a handkerchief and sat back. "Fine," she said to the stove. "Not that way." Outside, a branch cracked. Agnes froze. Then came an engine. Low, slow. She moved to the side of the broken window and kept herself behind the wall. Through fog and dirty glass, she saw a dark pickup stopped near the old Camp 3 sign. It was too far to read the plate, but close enough to know it was not there by accident. No one stepped out. The truck idled. Agnes fixed the details in her mind. Dark blue or black. One headlight dim. Silver toolbox in the bed. Dent near the left rear fender. After nearly a minute, the truck backed up, turned in the mud, and disappeared down the road. Agnes waited until the engine faded before she moved. Then she wrote it down. 8:26 a.m. Unknown pickup near Camp 3 sign, did not approach. Right headlight dim. Silver toolbox. Left rear dent. Her hand shook only after the last word. A hunter could have taken a wrong road. A logger could have been curious. Or a Harker man could have come to see whether an old widow had frightened herself enough to leave. Agnes looked back at the stove. The rectangular panel seemed smaller now, more ordinary, more dangerous. She spent the rest of the morning cleaning around it, not forcing it. She scraped soot from the seams and found a second empty bolt hole hidden beneath ash. Whoever had installed the plate had wanted it to look like part of the stove. Whoever removed the bolts had either been interrupted or had changed their mind. Near noon, she returned to Daniel's accident report. The report said he died at 4:40 p.m., but Mr. Vale had reached her house at 9:17 p.m., with a typed report already prepared, copied, and signed. 5 hours. In bad weather. From a remote cut zone. Through company channels. With negligence already printed beside Daniel's name. Agnes underlined the time. Then she checked the foreman line again. Earl Whitcomb. But Daniel had said Blevins. She opened Eli Mercer's old report. Whitcomb appeared there too. Faded but legible. Attached to another death the company had called unavoidable. Agnes sat back. A wrong name. A false plate. A truck waiting in fog. None of it was proof. Not yet. But proof did not always arrive whole. Sometimes it came as a loose bolt, a misspelled name, an idling truck, and a widow stubborn enough to write it all down. That evening, before the light failed, she returned to the stove with oil, Daniel's screwdriver, and the patience of a woman who had spent her life saving small things. The last bolt turned once. Behind the panel, something shifted with a dull, heavy sound. Agnes stopped breathing. She did not know it yet, but her hand had touched the edge of something men had spent decades trying to keep buried. Agnes did not open the panel that night. She wanted to. Every part of her wanted to force Daniel's screwdriver into the seam, pry until the metal gave way, and drag the hidden thing into the light. But the sky outside had gone black, the rain had returned, and the cookhouse had begun making all the small night sounds of a building that did not yet trust its new owner. So Agnes stopped. That had saved her more than once in life. She banked the fire low, moved Daniel's hard hat closer to her sleeping corner, and placed the notebook beneath her blanket where her hand could find it in the dark. The stove sat in the center of the room, warm and silent, with the loosened panel facing the wall like a mouth refusing to open. She slept badly. Twice she woke thinking she heard tires on the road. Once she sat up, certain someone had touched the door. But there was only rain, branches, and the hollow drip of water into the washtub. At dawn, Agnes made coffee without tasting it. She worked carefully. First, she cleared everything from the table. Then she spread a clean towel across the wood, placed her notebook, pencil, lantern, screwdriver, hammer, and a jar of oil in a straight line. She folded Daniel's coat and set it over the broken window ledge to block the wind. Only then did she kneel behind the stove. The last bolt had loosened during the night as the iron cooled. Agnes turned it slowly, stopping each time the metal groaned. When it finally came free, it dropped into her palm, warm from her hand and black with soot. The panel did not fall. Agnes slid the screwdriver under one edge and pressed. Nothing. She tapped the corner with the hammer. A thin line of ash broke loose. She pressed again. This time, the plate shifted. Behind it came the smell of old smoke, oilcloth, and paper that had been sealed away too long. Agnes set the panel on the floor. Inside the hollow space behind the stove sat a bundle wrapped in dark oilcloth, tied with wire. It was wedged tight between two iron braces. She had to pull with both hands. For a moment, it did not move. Then it came free all at once, heavy enough that she nearly dropped it. She carried it to the table. Her fingers left black marks on the cloth. The wire had rusted into the folds. Agnes cut it with Daniel's old pliers. The oilcloth opened stiffly, like something waking after years in a grave. Inside was a ledger. Its cover was black. The corners burned brown, the spine cracked but still holding. Across the front, someone had written in faded white pencil, "Camp 3 meals and supplies." Agnes almost laughed. Meals and supplies. A Cookhouse book. Nothing more. But when she opened it, the first page did not list flour, bacon, coffee, or beans. It listed names. The columns were drawn by hand. Date, man, crew, official cause, actual cause, witness, settlement, notes. Agnes did not move. The fire behind her ticked softly. She read the first line on the open page. Daniel Holloway. Her mouth went dry. The date was wrong. Not wrong by much. Wrong by enough. The ledger said Daniel had been injured at 3:20 p.m., more than an hour before the company report claimed. It listed Blevins as foreman, not Whitcomb. Under official cause, the handwriting read, worker negligence. Under actual cause, it read, cut. Zone opened early under order. Agnes gripped the edge of the table. The next column said, witness, T. Reyes, Tom Reyes, the old sawyer at the back of her kitchen after the funeral. The man who had almost spoken. The settlement column had a number beside it. Then one word, withheld. Agnes sat down because her knees had lost their strength. For several minutes, she could not turn the page. She could only look at Daniel's name, written by a hand that had not known her, but had known enough to write the truth. He had not been careless. The room blurred. Agnes pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed until she could see again. Then, she turned the page. There were more names. Some she knew from town. Some were old enough to belong to men whose sons had gray hair now. Beside each name were the clean words companies used when they wanted death to look tidy. Equipment failure, operator error, failure to follow procedure, unsafe conduct. Beside those words, in the actual cause column, the handwriting told another story. Cable frayed and reported twice. Foreman ordered crew below unstable slope. Doctor instructed to record fall, not crush injury. Widow pressured before burial. Witness paid. Witness threatened. Settlement withheld. Agnes turned another page. Then another. The dates moved backward through years, then decades. Her father's name appeared on a page near the middle. Ellie Mercer. Agnes made a sound then. Not a sob, not a word. Something smaller and older. Under official cause, equipment failure. Under actual cause, brake line reported unsafe 3 days prior. Witness, H. Dobbins. Settlement. Denied. Notes. Widow unable to challenge. Agnes put both hands flat on the table. Her mother had not imagined it. Her mother had not misunderstood. Her mother had not been too poor, too tired, too ignorant, or too broken to know something was wrong. She had simply been alone against a machine built to outlast her. Agnes read until the coffee went cold. The ledger was not one secret. It was a map of a system. Every few pages, the Harker name appeared. Sometimes as an initial, sometimes in full. There were references to doctors, foremen, county officers, bank liens, and private settlements that never reached the women whose husbands had died earning them. There were notes written in different ink across different years. That meant one person had started the record, and someone else had continued it. Near the back, Agnes found a folded letter pressed between two pages. The paper was thin and brittle. To whoever finds this, it began. Agnes held her breath and read. The writer was Mabel Crane, cook at Camp 3 from 1948 to 1976. Her husband had died under a falling spar tree. The company called it misjudgment. She called it murder by neglect. After that, men came through the cookhouse hungry, tired, angry, frightened, and careless with the truth. Mabel listened while pouring coffee. She copied names from meal sheets, injury notices, payroll slips, and things men said when they thought a woman near the stove was only part of the furniture. I could not stop them, Mabel had written. So I wrote them down. Agnes lowered the letter. For the first time since entering the cookhouse, she looked at the room differently. The long tables were not only tables. The stove was not only a stove. This place had heard things offices never recorded. It had held the last ordinary mornings of men who did not know their names would be changed after death. Agnes turned to the final pages. Daniel's entry was not the last. There were blank lines after him, waiting. That frightened her more than the filled ones. She closed the ledger and wrapped it again. Not tightly enough to hide it from herself, only enough to protect the pages. Then, she opened her own notebook and began copying the first entries by hand. Daniel Holloway, Ellie Mercer. Names, dates, causes, witnesses, notes. Her pencil moved steadily. The discovery had 3 weights, and Agnes felt each one settle on her. The first was practical. The withheld settlements could save her house, and not only hers. If the numbers were true, Harker Timber owed money to dozens of families. The second was personal. Daniel had not died in shame. Neither had her father. The third was heavier than both. If Agnes kept the ledger hidden, she could protect herself for a little while. If she brought it into the open, she would be standing against 3 generations of men who had buried workers with paperwork and called it business. She looked at Daniel's hard hat at the end of the table. The small cross inside the rim faced her. Agnes touched the ledger with one soot-stained hand. "No more," she said. Outside, beyond the broken windows, a truck engine sounded faintly on the old road. This time, Agnes did not freeze. She closed the ledger, lifted it against her chest, and carried it away from the stove. The engine faded before it reached the clearing. Agnes stood in the cookhouse, with the ledger pressed against her chest, and listened until the old road went quiet. Rain tapped the roof. Water dripped into the washtub. Behind her, the stove clicked as the iron cooled. Then she did what her mother would have done. She made copies. Not with a machine. Not yet. She had no electricity, no clean road, and no reason to believe she could walk into town unseen. So she sat at the long table and copied the first pages by hand into her brown notebook. Daniel Holloway, Ellie Mercer, Harlan Price, Joseph Crane, Ray Donnelly. Names became lines. Lines became pages. Her fingers cramped, but she kept writing until the pencil had worn down to a stub. When she finished, she wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and hid it outside beneath a loose stone near the rain barrel lean-to, under mud and blackberry roots. Then she placed a bundle of old newspaper behind the stove panel and fastened it loosely with one bolt. Let them find something, just not the truth. The first visit came the next morning. A Harker timber truck rolled into the clearing while Agnes was boiling coffee. She saw the green logo through the broken window and stepped onto the porch before they could knock. Mr. Vale got out first. Behind him stood a broad man in a waxed coat, his eyes fixed on the cookhouse door. "Mrs. Holloway," Vale said, "we heard you took possession of the old property." "You heard right. We're concerned for your safety." "That concern come before or after Daniel died?" The man behind him shifted his weight. Vale forced a smile. "This structure is unstable. Harker Timber would be willing to purchase it from you. Generously." Agnes looked at the sagging roof, the mud, the cracked windows, the smoke leaking thinly from the stovepipe. "You let it go for taxes. An administrative oversight. You watched me buy it for $11. That was before we understood your intentions. My intentions are to stay dry and mind my business." Vale handed her an envelope. $5,000. "Today, you sign the transfer, and this becomes one less burden. $5,000. Enough for rent, food, a lawyer's first fee, time." Agnes thought of the ledger under the stone. Then she thought of Daniel's name misspelled. "No." The broad man stepped forward. "You should think carefully." "I did," Agnes said. "That's why the answer is no." They left without another word, but the truck carved deep ruts into the mud. That night, someone came back. Agnes woke to the front door rope pulling tight against the bench. Wood scraped. The handle jerked once, then again. She sat up in darkness, one hand already on the hammer beside her blanket. "Who's there?" she called. No answer. The handle turned slowly. Agnes struck a match. Flame bloomed inside the lantern. Her shadow rose huge along the wall. "I have a hammer," she said, voice steady, "and I write down everything." For a moment, nothing moved. Then, footsteps crossed the porch. Fast, heavy. A board cracked under someone's weight. Outside, an engine started hard and tore away down the road. Agnes waited until silence returned. Only then did she breathe. In the morning, she found the stove panel disturbed. The single bolt had been turned halfway out. The newspaper bundle she had left inside was dragged onto the floor and torn open. They had come for the stove. Not food, not tools, not money. The stove. She went outside to the rain barrel lean-to and knelt in the mud. The loose stone was still in place. Her fingers pushed beneath it and touched oilcloth. The ledger was safe. But safety had become temporary. That afternoon, Agnes drove into town with 3 copied pages folded inside her coat lining. The road was slick after rain, but fear made her careful, not careless. At the county clerk's office, she asked for old accident filings from Harker Camp 3. The clerk with red glasses lowered her voice. "Mrs. Holloway, are you sure?" "No," Agnes said, "but I'm asking anyway." The woman studied her, then pulled a form from beneath the counter. "Public records request." "It may take time. I've got more of that than money." When Agnes left, Sheriff Coyle stood near her truck. He removed his hat as if they were at church. "You've been stirring up old dust. I've been reading. Some papers belong to the company. Dead men don't." His eyes hardened. "If you're holding stolen property, you could make trouble for yourself." Agnes opened the truck door. "Then tell whoever sent you that I'm very interested in what they think was stolen." She drove away before he answered. By evening, the rumor had started. At the grocery, someone whispered that grief had loosened her mind. At church, a woman said the cookhouse was making her bitter. At the diner, a logger Agnes had known for 20 years looked away when she entered. The town was not attacking her all at once. It was stepping back far enough that Harker Timber could reach her without witnesses. On the third night after the discovery, Agnes found a letter nailed to the cookhouse door. No envelope, no signature. Old women should let old things stay dead. She read it once. Then she dried it by the stove and placed it between 2 pages of her notebook. Evidence. Near midnight, a soft knock came at the door. Not the hard pull of the intruder. A knock. Agnes lifted the lantern. "Mrs. Holloway." She knew the voice before she opened the door. Tom Reyes stood on the porch with rain dripping from his hat. His left hand was tucked deep in his coat pocket, hiding the missing fingers everyone pretended not to notice. "I saw the truck," he said. Agnes did not move. Tom looked past her toward the stove. "If they came for that," he said quietly, "then what you found is worse than I thought." Agnes opened the door wider. For the first time since Daniel died, someone stepped into the cookhouse not to threaten her, not to buy her out, and not to tell her to be quiet. He stepped in like a man finally tired of silence. Tom Reyes stepped into the cookhouse and removed his hat. For a moment, neither he nor Agnes spoke. Rain dripped from the brim onto the floorboards. The lantern showed the deep lines in his face, and the left hand he kept buried in his coat pocket. Agnes closed the door. "You knew something," she said. Tom looked toward the stove. "I knew enough to be afraid. That is not the same as telling the truth." "No," he said. "It isn't." The plainness of the answer kept Agnes from turning him out. She set the lantern on the table. Daniel's hard hat sat beside her notebook. Tom saw it and lowered his eyes. "I was there that day," he said. "Not beside Daniel. Lower slope. Different crew. But I heard Blevins yelling before the tree came down." Agnes stood very still. "The cut zone wasn't ready," Tom said. "Men said so. Daniel said so. But the trucks were waiting, and Harker wanted that section cleared before the storm got worse." Then, "Why did the report say Whitcomb?" "Because Whitcomb signs what he's told to sign." Agnes laid 3 copied pages on the table. Tom did not touch them at first. Then he bent closer. His face changed when he saw Daniel's name. It changed again when he saw the witness column. T. Reyes. Tom sat down heavily. "They put me in there. You tell me." He pulled his left hand from his pocket. 3 fingers were gone, leaving only his thumb and 1 crooked finger. "They took these in '84, he said. "Saw jammed. Guard had been loose for a month," I told the foreman. 2 other men told him too. After it happened, they gave me papers while I was still on pain medicine. Said if I signed, I'd get a settlement. Said if I didn't, I'd get nothing. Did you get it?" Tom looked at his hand. "Enough to keep quiet 1 winter." Agnes listened without interrupting. For the next hour, Tom helped her read the ledger codes from the copied pages. Camp numbers, crew initials, foreman marks, small symbols beside names that meant widow contacted, witness pressured, payment held. He did not solve the mystery for her. He only gave shape to what she had already found. By morning, Agnes had a list. Not just dead men. Widows, sons, daughters, people who had grown old, believing their fathers or husbands had caused their own deaths. The first house Agnes visited belonged to Ruth Price. Ruth was nearly 80 and lived in a blue trailer at the edge of town. Wind chimes made from old spoons hung over the steps. When Agnes mentioned Harlan Price, Ruth's face closed. "I don't talk about that. I understand." "No, you don't." Agnes placed 1 copied page on the kitchen table. Ruth stared at it. Her hands began to tremble. "They said he was drunk," Ruth whispered. "Harlan never drank before a shift." "Never." Agnes said. "I believe you." The old woman sat down as if her legs had disappeared. After Ruth came Nora Donnelly, who opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. Then Mrs. Crane's niece, who kept old letters in a cedar chest. Then a retired payroll clerk who remembered envelopes being returned to the company office instead of mailed. Some people refused to speak. Some told Agnes to leave it alone. Some cried before they said a word. But a few brought out papers. A death notice folded into a Bible. A settlement letter never cashed. A photograph of a husband beside a logging truck. A doctor's note that did not match the company report. Agnes copied everything. Tom drove when the road was bad. He waited outside when women did not want a man in the room. He split firewood and repaired the porch step, but he never touched the ledger unless Agnes handed it to him. "This is yours to carry," he told her. "No," Agnes said. "It belongs to all of them." "Maybe. But you found it. That means you decide how it gets used." The next ally was Leah Vance, a young reporter from the county paper. She arrived after Ruth called her, with rain-frizzed hair and a recorder in her coat pocket. "I was told you have documents," Leah said. "I have copies," Agnes answered. "Do you have the original?" Agnes watched her carefully. "I have enough." Leah did not push. That was why Agnes let her sit. For 2 hours, Leah read the copied pages, the accident reports, and Agnes's notebooks. She asked careful questions. Dates, names, who delivered the envelope, who stood on the porch, who offered money for the cookhouse. When she finished, Her face had changed. "This is not one bad report," Leah said. "No, this is a pattern." Agnes looked at Daniel's hard hat. "That is what they counted on us never proving." Leah promised no headline yet. First, she would verify, search archives, request filings, and find families willing to speak on record. Agnes respected that. Truth needed more than anger. It needed legs. Within a week, the cookhouse changed. Tom patched the leak above the pantry. Ruth brought old dishes from Harlan's mother. Nora sent blankets, though she still would not visit. The retired clerk mailed payroll copies in a plain envelope with no return address. One Saturday, 3 widows came together. They stood outside in the rain, none ready to enter first. Agnes opened the door and waited. Finally, Ruth stepped inside. She looked at the long tables, the stove, the smoke-dark ceiling. "My Harlan ate here," she said. "Daniel too," Agnes answered. One by one, the women entered. They set their papers on the table beside Agnes's notebook. For the first time, the cookhouse held more than secrets. It held witnesses. That evening, Agnes sat by the stove while rain softened the clearing outside. The ledger was still hidden beneath the loose stone. Still dangerous, but it was no longer alone. Neither was she. The first article appeared on a Thursday morning. It did not accuse. Leah Vance was too careful for that. The headline was small, almost quiet. Old Camp 3 records raise questions about logging deaths. By noon, every copy of the county paper had disappeared, from the grocery, the diner, the gas station, and the post office. By evening, the Harker Timber Office had released a statement calling the article irresponsible, emotional, and based on unverified materials provided by a grieving widow. Agnes read that sentence twice. Grieving widow. They meant it as a weakness. She folded the paper and placed it in her notebook. Evidence. 3 days later, the county court announced a preliminary hearing. The official purpose was narrow: to determine whether newly discovered documents related to Harker Camp 3 were credible enough to reopen old compensation claims. But everyone in Briar Glen knew what it really was. It was Agnes Holloway against the Harkers. The hearing room filled before 9. Loggers stood along the back wall with their caps in their hands. Widows sat together in the second row, clutching envelopes, photographs, and old letters. Tom Reyes sat near the aisle, his damaged hand resting in plain sight for the first time Agnes had ever seen. Agnes sat at the front table beside Mr. Bell, a retired attorney who had once lost his older brother in a logging accident. He had agreed to help after seeing his brother's name in one of the copied pages. Across the room sat the Harker lawyers. Behind them was Randall Harker, silver-haired, clean-shaven, wearing a dark suit that looked too smooth for a logging town. His grandfather had founded the company. His father had expanded it. Randall had turned it into something that could smile at charity dinners while crushing people in private rooms. He did not look at Agnes. That suited her fine. The judge entered. Papers rustled. The room settled. The Harker attorney stood first. He spoke about chain of custody. He spoke about emotional distress. He spoke about an elderly woman living alone in an unsafe structure after a traumatic loss. He said the ledger was suspicious, possibly fabricated, and certainly inadmissible until proven otherwise. Then he turned slightly toward Agnes. Mrs. Holloway is not a lawyer. She is not an investigator. She is not a records expert. She is a grieving spouse with a financial motive. Agnes felt the room tighten around her. Mr. Bell leaned toward her. "Steady." "I am," she whispered. When Agnes was called, she walked to the witness chair with her notebook in both hands. She did not carry the ledger. Not yet. The original was locked in a bank box 2 towns over, under Leah's documentation and Mr. Bell's receipt. The lawyer began gently. "Mrs. Holloway, you loved your husband?" "Yes." "And his death caused you great pain?" "Yes." "And that pain made you angry at Harker Timber?" Agnes looked at him. "The report made me angry." A few people shifted in their seats. The lawyer smiled. "You believe you found a secret ledger inside an old stove. I found a ledger behind a false panel in the Camp 3 cookhouse stove. You expect this court to believe that a major timber company hid decades of crimes in a kitchen stove?" "No," Agnes said. "I expect the court to read what was written there." The smile faded. He asked about her education. Agnes answered. High school. He asked whether she had training in law. She answered, no. He asked whether grief could affect memory. She answered, yes. That is why I wrote things down before grief could rearrange them. Mr. Bell placed Agnes's notebook before the court. Page after page showed dates, times, names, weather, visitors, phone calls, trucks, letters, and conversations. Daniel's last morning, Mr. Vale's arrival, the wrong foreman's name, the offer to buy the cookhouse, the night someone tried to open the door, the threatening letter. The lawyer tried to dismiss it as a widow's habit. Agnes said, a habit is still a record if it is kept honestly. Then Mr. Bell introduced the first copied page from the ledger. Daniel Holloway. The hearing room went silent. Mr. Bell read the columns aloud. Date, crew, official cause, actual cause, witness, settlement, notes. When he reached the word withheld, Agnes heard Ruth Price begin to cry softly behind her. The Harker lawyer objected. The judge allowed the page for preliminary review. Then came Eli Mercer, Agnes's father. Then Harlan Price. Then Joseph Crane. Then Ray Donnelly. Name after name entered the room like men walking back from the forest after being called dead too cheaply. The lawyer rose again, sharper now. These are handwritten entries of unknown origin. Anyone could have written them. Mr. Bell nodded once. That is why we called Mrs. Crane's niece. A woman in a blue coat came forward carrying a cedar box. From it, she removed letters written by Mabel Crane, the Camp 3 cook from 1948 to 1976. The handwriting was compared with the letter found inside the ledger. The loops, slant, and hard downward strokes matched closely enough for the judge to lean forward. Then Leah Vance testified about public filings. She had found death reports, payroll sheets, and court notices that matched ledger entries across 30 years, not perfectly. That made them stronger. Lies were often too smooth. These records were messy in the same places real life was messy. Tom Reyes was called last. He walked slowly to the front. When asked to raise his right hand, he did. When asked about Daniel's accident, he looked at Agnes before answering. Daniel warned them that Slope wasn't ready. The Harker lawyer stood. You were not beside him when the tree fell. No, so you cannot say what he did. Tom lifted his left hand. 3 fingers gone. The courtroom saw the old injury fully. I can say what Harker does after a man gets hurt. The room went still. Tom told them about the saw guard, the pain medicine, the papers, the promise of money, the warning that no one worked again if they caused trouble. The lawyer tried to stop him. The judge let him continue. Then Mr. Bell placed the threatening letter on the evidence table. Old women should let old things stay dead. Mrs. Holloway, he said, what did you do when you received this? Agnes looked at the Harker table. I dried it by the stove and saved it. Why? Because men who tell women to forget usually have something they need forgotten. No one laughed. No one moved. For the first time all morning, Randall Harker looked at her. Agnes did not look away. The judge did not rule that day on everything. Courts did not move like lightning. They moved like old rivers, slow and heavy. But before the hearing ended, he ordered the original ledger secured, Harker timber records preserved, and all Camp 3 accident files from the past 40 years produced for review. The Harker attorney objected. The judge overruled him. A sound moved through the courtroom. Not applause, not celebration, something smaller. A breath released by many people at once. Outside, reporters waited under umbrellas. Leah stood beside the courthouse steps, notebook open, rain dotting her sleeves. Agnes came out with Daniel's hard hat held against her side. Mr. Vale stood near the stone railing. His face looked pale beneath the courthouse lights. Randall Harker passed close enough for only Agnes to hear him. You have no idea what you've started. Agnes looked at the courthouse doors, then at the widows gathering behind her, each holding papers that had once been too heavy to carry alone. Yes, she said, I do. Then she walked down the steps into the rain, not as a woman begging a company to correct one report, but as the keeper of a truth too large to fit back inside a stove. The court order changed Briar Glen before the verdict ever came. For the first time in decades, Harker Timber could not decide which papers stayed buried. File boxes came out of locked rooms. Payroll records were carried from storage sheds. Old accident reports were pulled from cabinets that smelled of dust, mildew, and ink. Men who had spent years looking away began remembering. A retired medic admitted that company doctors had been told to soften certain injury descriptions. A former dispatcher brought in weather logs, showing crews had been sent into unstable cuts after storms. A bookkeeper, old and frightened, confirmed that settlement checks had been issued, but never delivered to several widows. The ledger did not stand alone anymore. That was what broke the Harkers. Not one page, not one widow, not one angry article. A pattern. Leah Vance's second article ran across the full front page of the county paper. This time, the headline did not whisper. Camp 3 ledger matches decades of withheld settlements. By noon, state labor investigators had arrived. By evening, Harker Timber announced a temporary suspension of senior management. Randall Harker called it cooperation. No one in Briar Glen believed him. At the final hearing, the room was even fuller than before. Agnes sat at the front with her notebook, Daniel's hard hat on the table beside her. Tom Reyes sat behind her. Ruth Price held Harlan's photograph in both hands. Nora Donnelly came at last, carrying the Bible where her husband's death notice had been folded for 32 years. The judge read slowly. Harker Timber was ordered to release all Camp 3 safety records. The old compensation claims would be reopened. Withheld settlement funds would be reviewed and repaid with penalties where fraud was proven. The state would investigate falsified reports, witness intimidation, and improper influence over local officials. Sheriff Coyle resigned before the week ended. Earl Whitcomb, old now and living in a white house beyond the mill, gave a sworn statement through his attorney. He admitted he had signed reports he did not write. He said he had been told it was better for families to receive something quiet than fight a company they could never beat. Agnes read that line in the paper and set it down. Something quiet. That was what they had wanted. Quiet widows, quiet children, quiet graves, quiet records, quiet money that never reached the hands it was meant for. But the Cookhouse had not stayed quiet. The first check Agnes received was not large enough to heal anything. No amount would have been. Still, she held it in both hands at the kitchen table inside the cookhouse and looked at Daniel's corrected record beside it. Cause of death amended pending final investigation. No finding of worker negligence. She touched that sentence with one finger. It was not Daniel back at the door. It was not his laugh in the kitchen. It was not his boots drying by the stove. But it removed the stone they had placed on his name. That mattered. Other families received letters too. Ruth Price came to the cookhouse with her letter tucked inside her coat. She did not open it at first. She simply sat at the long table and cried, with one hand pressed over Harlan's name in the copied ledger. Nora Donnelly received a payment she never expected and used part of it to repair the roof over her daughter's house. Tom Reyes was offered a private settlement for his hand. He refused the first version. "They don't get my silence twice," he said. Agnes smiled when he told her. Harker Timber sent one final offer through a law firm in Portland. They wanted to buy the cookhouse. The number was larger than Agnes had ever seen written beside her name. Enough to buy another house. Enough to leave Briar Glen and never hear the mill whistle again. Enough to make people say she would be foolish to refuse. She read the offer once. Then she placed it on the stove and set Daniel's hard hat on top of it. When Mr. Vale came to collect her answer, he looked thinner than before. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "this could make your life easier." Agnes stood beside the old iron stove. The same stove that had held the ledger through years of rain, ash, and silence. "No," she said. His eyes dropped to the hard hat. "This building has caused enough trouble." Agnes looked around the room. The long tables, the smoke-dark ceiling, the cracked stove, the women's papers stacked neatly in boxes along the wall. "No," she said again. "This building kept the truth when people wouldn't." Mr. Vale had no answer for that. When he left, Agnes took the offer letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in her notebook. Not because she needed it, because evidence had become a habit, and habits had carried her this far. That evening, the rain stopped before sunset. A pale gold light moved through the firs, and touched the cookhouse windows. Agnes carried Daniel's hard hat outside and stood in the clearing. For the first time since his death, she said his name aloud without feeling it had been stolen. Daniel Holloway. The forest did not answer, but it no longer felt like it was hiding him. Agnes did not turn the cookhouse into something pretty. That was the first thing she decided. People in town had ideas. Some said it could become a heritage cafe. Others suggested a visitor center with polished floors and framed photographs under clean glass. One man from the county historical board said the cracked stove should be removed before anyone got hurt. Agnes listened to all of them. Then she said no. The stove stayed. The long tables stayed. The smoke-dark ceiling stayed. Even the scorch mark behind the stove stayed. Because some scars were not meant to be painted over. They were meant to tell the truth without asking permission. With part of the settlement money, Agnes repaired only what needed saving. The roof was patched. The broken windows were replaced with plain glass. The porch was rebuilt from cedar boards. Tom Reyes cut himself. A proper lock went on the door, not to keep people out, but to protect what the room had become. The cookhouse did not shine. It breathed. On clear mornings, sunlight came through the new windows and fell across the same tables where hungry men had once sat before walking into the timber. On rainy afternoons, the stove gave off steady heat and the smell of coffee returned to the room. Not company coffee, not the bitter black tin cups of old Camp 3. Coffee made by widows, daughters, sons, and old men who had finally run out of silence. Agnes built the memorial wall slowly. She refused to let anyone rush it. Each name had to be checked. Every date had to be confirmed. Every family had to decide how their dead should be remembered. Some wanted only a name. Some wanted a photograph. Some brought small things, a pipe, a pocket knife, a lunch pail, a folded union card, a wedding picture, a child's drawing saved for 40 years in a Bible. Daniel's hard hat went up last. Agnes held it longer than she expected. Tom stood beside her, pretending not to watch too closely. Ruth Price sat at one of the tables with a handkerchief in her lap. Leah Vance stood near the door with her notebook closed for once. Agnes touched the faded cross inside the rim. Then she placed the hard hat on a wooden shelf beneath Daniel's name. Daniel Holloway, beloved husband, timber faller, careful man. Agnes stepped back. For a moment, the room blurred. Not because she had lost him again. Because, at last, the room had given him back. The first memorial supper was held in early spring, when rain still clung to the fir branches but the air had begun to soften. No one planned anything fancy. Ruth brought beans with ham. Nora Donnelly brought cornbread. Tom carried in a pot of stew with his good hand and pretended it was not too heavy. Someone brought apple pie. Someone else brought coffee so strong it made Leah cough. They set the food on the long tables. For the first time in decades, the cookhouse fed people without taking anything from them. Agnes stood near the stove and watched the room fill. Widows who had once crossed the street to avoid one another now sat shoulder to shoulder. Men who had signed what they were told to sign sat with their hats in their hands. Children who had grown up hearing half-truths about grandfathers they never met walked along the memorial wall and read the names aloud. Not loudly, just clearly. That was enough. Before they ate, Tom stood. He was not a man who liked being looked at. His ears reddened. His damaged hand trembled at his side. But he faced the room anyway. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. No one interrupted. He swallowed. "I can't fix that. But I can say their names now." He turned toward the wall and read the first name. Then Ruth read the second. Then Nora read the third. One by one, the room joined in. When they reached Daniel, Agnes said it herself. Daniel Holloway. Her voice did not break. Outside, rain began again. Light against the roof. Inside, the stove burned steady, its old iron holding warmth the way it had once held a secret. Later, after the dishes were washed and the last truck had pulled away, Agnes remained alone in the cookhouse. The room was quiet, but not empty. She walked to the table where the ledger lay open inside a glass case Leah had helped arrange. Beside it sat Mabel Crane's letter, preserved under careful light. "I could not stop them, so I wrote them down." Agnes read the sentence again. Then she opened her own brown notebook. For most of her life, she had used it to record what powerful men hoped she would miss. Dates, names, weather, doors closed, papers refused, trucks in fog, words spoken too cleanly. Now she turned to a fresh page. Her pencil hovered for a moment. Then she wrote. He was not careless. None of them were. And this place was not worthless. She closed the notebook and set it beside the ledger. The fire settled low. The restored windows reflected the room back at her. The tables, the memorial wall, the stove, the names, the empty shelf space left for truth still on their way. Agnes put on Daniel's old coat and stepped onto the porch. The clearing was dark and wet. Fir trees stood around the cookhouse like witnesses. The old Camp 3 road disappeared into mist, but it no longer looked like a road leading away from everything she had lost. It looked like a road people could follow back. Agnes stood there until the rain touched her face. She had not become rich. She had not become powerful. She had not made grief disappear. But she had taken a place the world called useless and let it speak. She had taken a name the company tried to stain and washed it clean with patience, paper, and fire. Behind her, the cookhouse windows glowed warm in the Oregon rain. Inside, the old stove held its flame. And for the first time in a long time, Agnes Holloway had a home that did not ask her to be silent.